So I'm Anthony Van Brown and I'm a homosexual.
Anthony Van Brown is a former Pentecostal preacher who's been building bridges between religious communities and LGBTQ+ people for decades.
For much of my life, I never would have dared to make such a public declaration. I'm also a survivor. Born in 1951, I grew at a time when most lawmakers, medical professionals and the community viewed homosexuals as deviants, perverts and sociopaths.
But Anthony ended up on a most unexpected mission and helped outlaw gay conversion therapy, once famously satirised by South Park in a highly contested and controversial episode because it portrayed conversion therapy as an ineffective treatment and linked it to suicide.
With Jesus I can just say no and not be confused anymore.
I know Anthony Van Brown from his decades of advocacy for a prohibition on conversion practices and raising awareness of conversion practices. And Anthony was always a really great resource to that campaign because he understood people of faith who were one of the larger opponents of reform initially.
Advocacy for me really is very much about being a voice for the voiceless, going to places where angels fear to tread.
This person was the guy who wrote the book that pretty much saved my life.
Anthony himself is a survivor of conversion therapy.
I remember being told that no one is born gay. Everyone is born heterosexual. Something has happened to you, and we're here to fix that.
He had a complex personal life.
I was daddy's girl, so it hit me really hard for myself just because, you know, the family had broken down and I loved our family.
Happy Mardi Gras.
And ultimately became a revered changemaker.
People who will say things like, I don't get gay pride. Well, the reason you don't get gay pride is you haven't experienced gay shame.
After years of lobbying and debate, historic New South Wales laws banning gay conversion therapy were passed by the Labor government. Anthony Van Brown was here at State Parliament to celebrate.
The outcomes of these practices are tragically predictable. That's why the legislation and program being launched today are so vital. Some will argue that this legislation infringes on religious freedoms or parental rights, but it's not anti-religion. This is about ending the well-documented harm and protecting vulnerable LGBTQA people.
Now begins the process of turning these new laws into practice.
This legislation seeks to ban practices that are ignorant and disrespectful. Those practices say that people in the LGBTQA+ community are broken. They're not broken. They don't need fixing.
Over a decade ago, I worked with Anthony to pass a motion through the Legislative Assembly condemning conversion practices. We worked with Anthony and other survivors of conversion practices, Equality Australia and other advocacy groups to get the bill drafted.
Let us be clear, this is a proposed ban on speech, on religious freedoms and on parental authority.
For years, aspects of the bill were challenged, with opponents fearing a parent's right to guide their child would be hindered.
Nobody had any qualms about banning those particular practices. That had unanimous support across the chamber. But hidden deep within the bill, there were other meanings, and one of those meanings were around the suppression, and that a parent having a discussion, particularly around a child's sexual identity or their mannerisms and what they were seeking in life, could be deemed to be suppressing that particular child's views.
I put myself behind the ban for conversion therapy for a very particular reason. Number one, I've been spending years working with thousands of conversion therapy survivors. So if anybody in Australia knew about the impact that this had had, not only on people's mental health, but also on their attempts at suicide and suicides themselves. How could I step back and just ignore all these stories that I had heard? I had to do something.
Anthony has come a long way from where he grew up in Sydney's Hunters Hill in the 50s.
My dad, he was the trainer of the servers in the church and also in Hunters Hill. Actually, our life revolved very much around the church.
Though Anthony had been raised in the Anglican Church, as a teenager he became attracted to Pentecostalism.
It began with going to the healing service at St Andrew's Cathedral, which was known to there be speaking in tongues. But then a church started in Tarramurra called Faith Centre, and it was probably Sydney's very first mega church. I think from that point on, I was pretty well sold that I was not to go back to a dry liturgy or boring sermons, that I was going to go to a church that had some life and exuberance, and it was exciting.
At the same time, Anthony's teenage years in suburbia also held a secret and troubling side as he struggled with same-sex attraction.
In the 60s, the only option for me was this anonymous sex with people in parks. And so, you know, seeking that out started to make me really, really depressed, because afterwards I didn't feel better, I felt worse. And so I prayed to God and everything, and nothing would happen. But then it just got so bad at one point that I decided that I would take my life. It had been on my mind a few times, but, you know, when I mentioned that to the next door neighbour, who I got along very well with, she was a nurse, she said, "You've got to tell your mother." Then I started seeing a psychiatrist. At that time in Sydney, aversion therapy was happening with the infamous Dr. Neil McConaughey.
Dr. Neil McConaughey was an Australian psychiatrist, well known for leading gay aversion therapy. He practiced in Sydney in the 60s and 70s. These types of therapies used electric shocks or nauseating drugs to inhibit so-called deviant urges. But there was also religious conversion therapy without the electric shocks or drugs.
At that time, homosexuality was illegal. People were being institutionalised, people were being imprisoned, and people were experiencing aversion therapy. So I narrowly missed aversion therapy, which was actually happening in Sydney at that time. I went to a psychiatrist who was into talk therapy.
At 21, as a Christian who saw homosexuality as unnatural and wrong, he voluntarily put himself in a Pentecostal residential home to be fixed.
Initially, when I went through that residential program in 1972, I remember being told that no one is born gay. Everyone is born heterosexual. Something has happened to you, and we're here to fix that. I was told it would take about 2 years for me to become straight, and that I had to do things like change spark plugs in a combi, change the oil, mow the lawns. Everything was outside the house because they were male jobs. I couldn't do any cleaning inside, I couldn't do any cooking. They were female jobs. And also, I told what to wear. Very, very boring beige. And at that stage, bikini underwear had become popular. And that's what I had. But I told all homosexuals like bikini underwear. So all that was removed, and I had to wear white fronts and very, very boring clothes. This was all to get rid of the gay in me.
At this time, Anthony also underwent deliverance, otherwise known as exorcism.
Normally your head doesn't turn around on your shoulders, but there can be lots of coughing, spluttering, screaming, you know, very, very outward signs that something is going on. I was told that I need to keep breathing in, you know, expelling the demon, Of course, what was happening was I was expelling myself with oxygen and my hands started to tingle. I thought, oh my God, this is happening, you know, the demon's there. But it actually I was hyperventilating. And then, of course, they put down some newspaper in front of me because you would cough up the spirit or spit out the spirit or something rather like that. And the idea was that if you stay in this long enough and you're not exposed to temptation, that eventually the natural heterosexuality will begin to rise and take over. And part of the program was to ensure that you had no pride. And so there were times when I was humiliated in front of the church there.
After 6 months, he left religious conversion therapy ostensibly fixed. Now a straight man, Anthony moved to Orange for a new start.
When I was in the church in Orange, it was only a little small church, maybe about 60 people. There weren't really any young people. And suddenly this lovely young girl arrived from New Zealand to live with her parents. And so she started coming to the church, and Pentecostals are well known for their matchmaking. So here was my future wife and myself. Obviously, we are going to get together and we're going to get married. Maybe if I get married, that will be the answer.
Anthony married Helen in 1974. It was a busy period in his Christian life as a minister. The couple had 2 daughters and eventually settled on the New South Wales Central Coast.
Always a step of faith. Sure, there are many of you here this morning who could get up and give testimony that you have discovered yourself that God's word works in the when we give to God. Well, this has been up here for how long?
Well, I mean,
the boardwalk.
Yeah.
since the beginning of time, Dad.
The boardwalk.
Oh, right. Sorry, I thought you meant the rock face. I was like...
He wasn't like a traditional preacher. Dad was what they called an itinerant minister, which meant he did lots of travel. So my earliest memories are really not having Dad around all that much. He was away about 6 months of the year. So he was very absent, but it wasn't a problem because when he'd come home, it would just be so much fun. So that whole, like, quality versus quantity thing was a real thing in our family.
It was during these years of married life that Anthony was secretly meeting men.
Well, it was 1991. I was about to turn 40. Textbook midlife crisis. I met a guy. Jason was a very attractive man and came back to my motel. And for the first time in my life, I mean, I had had numerous sexual encounters previously, but the first time in my life, I experienced a connection. Like I didn't know this thing actually existed. He had awakened within me my real self, the gay self.
But Anthony's secret was exposed and his world imploded. His church forced him to admit his guilt to the congregation and step down as a minister.
I ended up having to do a public confession in front of church of 600 to 800 people and resigned from the ministry, which of course was devastating. And I remember holding on to the pulpit because I felt at any minute I was going to collapse on the stage. And I had been told by the Assembly of God leadership, don't mention homosexuality. Don't mention it. So I just very briefly just talked about, you know, I had committed adultery, I'd been unfaithful to my wife, and I was asking the church for forgiveness and forgiveness from God, and, you know, that I was resigning from the ministry.
That is where you know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, the puppy.
I was sitting in the front row of the church and we didn't know a lot about the back history of why Dad had fallen. We didn't know the full extent. but he got up there and said what he had to say, and I vividly remember him coming off the stage and falling into our arms.
My former wife, she was very supportive, unbelievably supportive, considering what had happened and how she'd been betrayed. So she was sitting in the church, as was one of my daughters. She'd been very composed, you know, to a point during all this drama. But then when I was up doing the public confession, that's when she lost it. And that's when friends gathered around her, and my daughter was there crying as well. It was horrendous. Words really are very difficult to find to describe how devastating that experience was. I remember thinking it was like being in a funeral, but I was a corpse.
I was Daddy's girl, so it hit me really hard for myself. The family had broken down, and I loved our family. I loved our family unit. I loved the things we did together. And so losing that, and then not knowing where Dad was for a period of time, and Mum just encouraging us no matter what, he's always your dad, and having that support. Yes, it was awkward and it was tough, and there was tears and there was sometimes anger.
Mum was the person who said to us, yeah, so your dad's gay, but you just still have to love him. And that's what we did. Like, so through all of her hurt and her pain and, you know, going through her own kind of separation and dealing with the fact that she found out her husband was gay, she really just encouraged us to keep a relationship with him.
Anthony and his wife tried to save their marriage, but eventually he moved out.
So I remember not long after Dad came out, and we were sitting in class doing English, and a lot of the authors that we were reading were gay. And I remember this girl said, listen, I don't really understand why we've got all these gay authors. And she really had this really negative view on it. So I'm going to say something here. So I got up in the middle of the classroom and said, listen, my dad's gay, and I think we just need to accept people for how they are. And my teacher was like, oh, okay, thanks, Rebecca. But, you know, it was a moment for me to go, he's my dad, and what you're talking about are just gay people. It's personal to me.
After his public fall from grace, Anthony worked as a salesman. He eventually became active in Sydney's gay community, advocating for it in Pentecostal churches.
Anthony is the founder and CEO of Ambassadors and Bridge Builders International. That's a nationally recognized advocate for LGBTIQA plus inclusion and equality.
I know Anthony is someone who is able to translate gay to religious and back, someone who really does build bridges between the LGBT community and people of faith and faith leaders.
Anthony decided to document what had happened to him in a book.
When I was doing a personal development course in 1999, I was confronted by so many principles I was familiar with. I came home from one of the meetings one night and I prayed for the first time in maybe about 8 years. And I just said, God, I don't understand this, but you and I are on speaking terms again. And then I have to say I heard some words, not with these ears, but the words were so clear to me. Tell your story. Be completely honest. It will help lots of people. And don't worry about a publisher. I will organise everything.
Anthony's book has now helped a generation of younger gay people resolve conflicts between their religion and sexuality.
I really, really loved your speech. It meant a lot.
I met Anthony Van Brown many, many years ago by accident, by complete accident. I was standing in a corporate networking event and I approached this older guy in the corner wearing a beret. I'll never forget he was wearing a beret. And we were just talking, we were chatting, and he asked out of nowhere, are you from a faith background? And I nearly spat my drink all over his face because I'd never had anyone in that sort of setting ask this sort of question. I quickly realised that this person was the guy who wrote the book that pretty much saved my life and allowed me to get a sense that others had been through the same torment that I had been through at Hillsong Church. And it was this book that actually made me more possible in the world.
In 2005, when he was 20 years old, Andrew Sloan was told to undergo conversion therapy.
I'd had 13 really hard years on the planet where this little queer kid wasn't really fully understood by the adults, let alone the children in my life. So there was tormenting, there was bullying in school, and my parents very lovingly didn't really know what this queer kid was all about. I was on the search for the very basics of love, acceptance, and really being embraced. And I found that in Jesus, and I found that at Hillsong. So I, was kind of celebrated. I was given so much responsibility to be a part of the youth choir, and I conducted the choir. I sang on albums for Hillsong Church. It was a thrill, an absolute thrill to be at Hillsong Church. Because sexuality for me was always in a big, sort of like a black box, I didn't have a great connection to who I was sexually for all of the years I was at Hillsong. And as my eyes were opened to other people's experiences of same-sex attraction inside of the church, I realized that I had a fundamental flaw or problem. And so one pretty harrowing night, I'll never forget, I drove to my pastor's house and it all came tumbling out. That kicked off a series of conversations at Hillsong that really set me on a path of leadership oversight over the choices that I then had to make next. I was asked to stop serving in any ministry. I was taken off the stage. I was asked to keep everything secret and private to myself and to senior leaders. And I was left completely alone. This was like the first part of complete isolation and separation from true support and true care. And during this time, the church worked with a psychologist, and they arranged for me to meet with this psychologist to get healed, to get fixed. And really punishingly and hurtful to me now as I sit here and speaking to you is that this psychologist is a specialist in child sex attraction. And what I was disclosing was same-sex attraction.
What started out as conversion therapy became the first steps in Andrew accepting himself.
So as soon as the psychologist realised that I was sitting in his consultancy room because I was same-sex attracted, but we started to have conversations about what it would be like to leave the church and to more fully embrace my same-sex attraction. It was the first adult conversations that I'd ever had, which would even make this possible.
Although Hillsong officially denounced conversion therapy in 2010, today most churches still don't fully accept LGBTQ+ people. In the last few years, multiple Baptist communities were expelled for recognising them as full members of the church.
This church is a church where all are welcome.
For the first time in the church's 96-year history, it's no longer affiliated with the Baptist Association of New South Wales and the ACT. Delegates from member churches voted yesterday on whether to remove Canberra Baptist Church and Newcastle's Hamilton Baptist Church over their pro-same-sex marriage stances. Of 250 delegates, 2/3 voted in favour of de-affiliation.
However, at Sydney's Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras Fair Day, all are welcome, whether religious or not.
Oh my God, the Quakers. Oh, we love the Quakers. Do you know that? We love you. Because you have been probably the most progressive Christian group in history around LGBTQ issues. I love Fair Day because it is such a microcosm, you know, like, it is a whole tribe. It's not just the party people, it is families, it is children, it is mums and dads, it's relatives, you know, it's boyfriends and girls, everybody is there, and lots of dogs. One of the things that I've learnt over the years is that essentially when you look at the Jewish faith or you look at Islam, and the issue of LGBTQ people, our community and our relationships, that the perceived conflicts are pretty much the same.
As someone who's gone through conversion therapy, who's gone for training in ministry, who's done while a lot of focus on so many negatives in the church, but for me, I can't live without my Catholic faith.
It's challenging, and as you know, for some people, you know, it is such a torturous journey that the religious suicides, we don't have the numbers, but it is above the average of LGBTQ people.
And while gay rights in Australia seem stable for now, the world is a volatile and uncertain place.
In Australia, we are different to the US, but we're also human. But I think that we have the checks and balances in place to ensure that we do not have a rollback of the hard-won rights and responsibilities that we won in Australia. And we need to just always be very, very conscious. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance.